evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, bringing together prominent New Yorkers with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When Mayor Bloomberg recently complained about actions taken by fellow Republican Governor George Pataki, much was made about what appeared to be the end of a honeymoon that had, at least publicly, gone on since the mayor's ascension to City Hall 21 months ago. The immediate cause of the disputes concerned a controversial bailout of lingering city debt approved by the state legislature over the veto of the governor, and a school reform commission formed by the governor that did not include anyone from the city. But these disputes, one on a budgetary item and the one on school policy, are emblematic of the historic tensions that have long existed between the mammoth downstate city and the upstate capital that controls its very existence. We are joined tonight by four prominent New Yorkers to talk about the relationship between the city and the state. Assemblyman Ruben Diaz Jr. represents the Soundview section of the Bronx. Assemblyman Daniel O'Donnell represents the Upper West Side and Morningside Heights, parts of Harlem and Manhattan Valley in Manhattan. Robert Pecorella is a professor of government and politics at St. John's University with an expertise in state and local government. And Joseph Mercurio is president of National Political Services Incorporated, who has run campaigns around the city and state for both Democrats and Republicans. Let me begin with you, Professor Pecorella. The tensions between the mayor and the city are part of a long story. This is not something unusual. How common is this?
Well, you go back all the way back, but you can certainly go to John Lindsay and Nelson Rockefeller, who had, as both Republicans, a terrible relationship, a very difficult relationship. The relationships between Mayor Beam and Governor Carey during the fiscal crisis weren't terribly good. And the relationships recently between Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki were strained at times, although 9/11 obviously changed a lot of that. I think the mayor's done an impressive job of keeping a lower profile than New York City mayors tend to in dealing with the governor. And I'm not sure he has much of a choice. He's dealing with a very, very tough political figure in George Pataki, and I think he needs to figure out a way to keep New York's interests in the front, and that becomes very difficult with Pataki.
Samuel O'Donnell, the educational panel that was just named, ostensibly is designed to figure out how much it costs to educate a child, growing out of a suit that argued that city children were getting shortchanged. Does it surprise you that the governor didn't put, at least initially, anybody from the city on the panel?
Not exactly. He has shown a total disregard for the education of our children for many years. I mean, if you look at the budget he proposed, and even the defense of that lawsuit, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity came forward with a very simple proposition, that is that all children deserve a basic sound education, and his lawyers went to court and said that that means an 8th grade education. And despite that fact, he was still reelected, claiming to be the education governor, and the Court of Appeals, which is not exactly someone to sneeze at. I mean, it's a very respected body among appellate courts in the country, came and said that the parents and concerned residents who brought the suit were entirely correct, and that the funding was not, formula was not fair, was not equitable, and it was shortchanging many students throughout the state. That he would not look to that and learn from that lesson and say, let me be broader, let me be more inclusive, and let me include political leaders from the city, even his own Republican mayor, shows just a callous disregard for the students of the city.
Senator Diaz, the other kind of flashpoint between the mayor and the city recently concerns a bailout of city debt going back to 1975, where the legislature passed a bill to basically transfer some of that debt up to Albany, up to we as state taxpayers, as opposed to the full burden as on we as city taxpayers. And that was passed over the governor's veto, and the governor and the Democratic controller of the state basically said, we don't care, we're going to block this plan. How do you, I mean, what does that tell us about how these two levels of government are working with each other?
Well, you got to understand, Bob, the history of MAC monies is what we call it, the Municipal Assistance Corporation money. And back in '75, in order to bail the city out from its fiscal woes, we allowed this new corporation to sort of bond out and raise money and give it to the city of New York. They raised $10 billion, but through 1984. But what happens is that there still was like over $2 billion debt. And so what we've been, many of us up in Albany, we try to do this year is to try to make sure that we have a commuter tax reinstated in the city of New York. New York City, subsequent to 9/11, is suffering financially. And we tried to do everything that we could with this governor to ensure that New York City has the funding so that we don't lay off firefighters, so that we don't lay off educators, and so that we provide the best education that we could possibly for our students here in the city of New York. The governor refused to do that. So what we did is that we passed our budget, and the governor, of course, vetoed it. We overrode his veto so that the state of New York absorbs the $500 million for the next several years until fiscal year of 2008, so that New York City can then, so it could free up some monies for the city of New York, and they could do the things that we need done for our students, for our seniors, and not close firehouses. The governor doesn't want to do that. He, he says that it's going to cost the state of New York, or the taxpayers of the rest of the state of New York, $170 million a year for the next 30 years. I think that that's a small price to pay when New York City has been the financial engine for the entire state of New York. I mean, we are the ones who contribute from 40 to 45% of the revenues to the state. And if New York City doesn't thrive, then New York State doesn't thrive. And I think that it's time that the rest of the state of New York realizes that we need a little bit of help. And in the long run, when our economy revitalizes, the entire state of New York will flourish again. And so, I mean, here we have a case of, again, a governor of the state of New York who continues to be inconsiderate of the city of New York. We have a mayor who's doing a poor and lousy job in advocating for the city. That's why the relationships aren't as strained as other mayoral and governor relationships in the past. I think that Bloomberg needs to step it up. I think that he needs to fight for the city that he represents.
Mr. Mercurio, fighting, a mayor fighting a governor is, clearly the state has the upper hand. I mean, a state legislature could vote to simply do away with the city of New York. I mean, we are in essence a creation of the state of New York. I mean, what are the implications for this? And if they do vote to do away with the city of New York, do I still have to pay my parking ticket?
Well, it's an interesting theoretical question, but the city of New York supplies way more than half of the financing for the state. The city is a very, very big chunk economically of the state government for its own revenue base and just as an economic engine for the entire region. So the governor really should be spending a lot more time taking care of the city than he has been. You had the mayor get elected at a very difficult moment right after 9/11. He took office with the anticipation that a businessman, somebody new, was going to be able to come in and get the city out of its disastrous condition. But instead, what wound up happening in the first year when he was mayor is he basically gave the governor and the president, two Republican colleagues who helped him get elected as mayor, he gave them a pass. He really let them get away with a lot that first year because the governor was up for re-election. He didn't talk about the deficit that the city had. He didn't point to the fact that the state had a deficit. You even had the Speaker of the Senate, Bruno,
The president,
the majority leader of the Senate,
a
Republican, contradicting the governor, saying there was going to be a substantial deficit and that we should start addressing the problem early. Other Democratic officials in the Assembly, the Speaker of the Assembly, and the leadership in the Democratic Party was all pointing to the fact that we had a difficult problem. The governor totally gave the city no regard. He promised everything, triangulating Democratic issues. The mayor let him get away with it, doing nothing but saying he had concerns for the city. Didn't fight hard enough for things like commuter tax, getting that back. A tax, by the way, that Republicans invented during the Lindsay years, that was passed at a time when you had a Republican governor and a Republican Assembly and Senate. I mean, it's sort of ludicrous that now the Republican governor is so against that tax. It's good for the city, and it would provide the revenue we need.
Except that, those were Rockefeller Republicans, which is now a dirty word. within the
Well,
Republican Party.
there were people who understood the financing of the city better than this governor does. And I think the fact that the governor didn't do anything for the mayor after the election and basically took advantage of him and neglected the city after the election, I think everybody's correct. The governor has taken advantage of the city, neglected the city, and the mayor really hasn't called him to task enough. And the one outburst that he had recently about the bond issue and objecting to that, the governor retaliated immediately. And the mayor is back now to his, compliant, submissive, I love the governor conversation, as if the governor was providing the city what it needed.
Let me take a slightly contrary point of view on. Let's talk just for a second about this lingering debt, about this debt bailout. As a city taxpayer, I checked these numbers this week. Right now, 18 cents of every dollar I pay in taxes now in the city goes to pay off debt that the city owns. That means before you can hire a cop, a CUNY professor, a social worker, or a sanitation worker, a teacher, 18 cents goes to pay off bondholders. In the state where you have about $40 billion of debt, the state hides all its debt off in these semi-independent authorities. So there's a very small amount of direct debt, but obviously this is all debt that the taxpayers are underwriting. It's about $1,900 $1,900 per capita we all owe. We would all have to pony up $1,900 to cover the state's debt. It seems to me that to some degree that the governor may be right on the substance of this issue, even if I think he's probably wrong on the law, because I think the legislature passed it. I assume that the legislature overrides the governor's veto. But I mean, could the governor be right on the substance of this, and even if he's wrong on the law? Doesn't the governor have a point about stretching out debt and that the damage that does to my kids? It may give me some relief now, and isn't that part of the give and take in this system?
I think that what we have to do as legislators, as the governor, assembly members, and state senators, is that we get elected, Bob, to make tough choices. And given the cards that we are dealt, I mean, it was not our fault that airplanes were rammed into the World Trade Center, and we lost over 200,000 jobs here in the city of New York. That's a loss of revenue. The city of New York is hurting. And so what we need to do now is speak to the rest of the state of New York, who has benefited for so long. Look, between the years of 92 and 97, 1992 and 1997, New York City, and I know it has increased, but the report came out where New York City contributed 46% of all of the personal income taxes for the state of New York, 46.7% of all the sales taxes, 32% of all the business taxes. We've done our fair share for so long. It has always been that way. And the one time now, because of a circumstance that we could not help in 9/11, where we need the rest of the state to come to our rescue, here we have the governor again turning his back on us. He's selective in accepting different bonds. Let's look at the 1996 Environmental Bond Act for a minute. This is a bond act that the majority of the people who voted for this, it was on referendum, were people from the city of New York. We want to be able to revitalize our waterfront. We want to be able to clean up our environment. But who benefited? He took the bond money, never criticized it, and gave it to people upstate where he know that he was going to get some votes. He's turned his back on the campaign finance for fiscal equity lawsuit. He's the one who agreed with a court decision that said that our children, it was good enough for our children in the city of New York just to have an 8th grade education. He continues to turn his back on us time and time and time again. He comes into many of our neighborhoods. As a Latino, I've seen him come into our neighborhoods speaking great Spanish, but actions speak louder than words, and his actions have been that of total neglect to the city of New York. Yes, it's going to cost us some debt in the long run, but in the long run, we'll wind up paying off. If we help the city now, the city's economy will revitalize, and the state of New York will flourish once again.
Jump in.
There is a point to be made, though. I mean, if you consider that the state controller, Alan Hevesy, also had some great problems with this rollover of debt, because Assemblyman Diaz was talking about MAC debt. This is debt from the 70s that oftentimes involves debt of the city spending money in those days on expense budget items it wasn't supposed to spend borrowed money on. We borrowed money to pay all that off. Think about this. That money was borrowed before many of you were born, and some of your kids are going to be paying this off 20 and 30 years from now for debt from the 1970s. So I agree with the Assemblyman. New York City drives this state, drives the economy of the state. This governor is incredibly cynical in the way he deals with New York City and the way he deals with politics in general. But there is a point to be made that at some point you've got to stop burdening future generations with your current expenses.
Yeah, but he
You know,
abdicated. I mean, he abdicated his responsibility by failing to put together a budget. He put together a budget that basically said the entire state can, just drop dead. I mean, if you look at the budget we passed was very thoughtful and very thought out. And the question really is, if you ask me to say, is this the best solution to the problem? The answer is probably not. What's the other solution, Governor? When have you given us anything at all that says this is a reasonable alternative to that solution? And the reality is the budget that we passed, not only did it come to the aid of New York City through MAC stuff, it was came to the aid of the suburbs. How do we get Joe Bruno and the Republicans in the state Senate to vote unanimously to override the veto? Very simply, the amount of money that would have been withheld from localities outside the city of New York to pay for their schools was so large and would have created such huge tax burdens on property taxes that the Republicans went along. This was not a good budget. It was the best budget that we could do. The MAC component of it may not be the best choice. Please someone stand up and say what the other choice is. And instead what we have is a governor who looks to what is going on in Washington in the hopes of getting a better job possibly someday and saying, I'm not really going to be governor anymore. I'm going to fly around, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to be actually involved in the day-to-day governing and coming up with a legitimate alternative to the problems, to the solutions that we created.
You know, the problem, the Assemblyman is exactly right. They were left with a problem by a prior Republican city administration. They dealt with the budget the best they could. The Republicans weren't willing to give the city the commuter tax, which would have been the better solution. I think Alan Hevesy was correct. This wasn't the way to do it. The way they should have done it was Giuliani as mayor. When we were going through surpluses in the 90s, they should have taken those surpluses and retired some of this debt from the 70s.
As they did,
Instead,
as Clinton did nationally.
Instead, he was running for the United States Senate at the time, and he was spending like a drunken sailor, and the money didn't go to retiring debt, and he left the legislature with a very difficult problem. No Republican support for a commuter tax being reinstated, having to solve the problem for the city, a mayor who wasn't willing to call the governor on his lack of attention to the city and unwillingness to deal with the budget properly, and they came up with a solution that wasn't the best way to do it.
If I could just jump in, Bob, I just want to echo what Danny was referring to. When we asked the governor to give us a budget, what he presented us with was a budget where we cut in his budget proposal $1.4 billion in education, almost $500 million to the education of the kids and the students of the city of New York, $2 billion in health care cuts. He wanted to cut all of the programs for CUNY and SUNY students that needed that because they can't pay for tuitions for themselves, or their parents can't. I think in the long run, if we had accepted his budget, the state of New York would have winded up having to dole out more than $170 million extra per year. I think when you give me the option of whether or not we should pick up MAC debt and pay $170 million for the next couple of decades, well, $170 million, and on the other hand, you're saying, well, if we don't do that, then we're not going to educate our kids. We're not going to send them to CUNY and SUNY. We're going to let health issues run wild without addressing them. In the long run, that's going to be more expensive to the state of New York. And that was the governor's solution. So I think that while ours wasn't the most ideal, the most perfect, it was certainly better than what the governor proposed. And so now he can't cry and say, because we gave him the opportunity. We wanted to work with him. I mean, how can he talk about $170 million and spending that with the state of New York? But every year, while he wants to cut certain programs, he still wants to increase money for the corrections department. He wants to build more prisons. He wants to incarcerate. He doesn't want to deal with Rockefeller drug laws. Right. I mean, there's so many different people in our communities that are first-time offenders, nonviolent, and he just wants to keep housing them in the correctional facilities. And so, on one hand, he's saying we should save money, but on the other hand, he's willing to spend more money incarcerating our folks.
I think that, and I think the people, the students in the audience here should think about that, because this is something that you're going to have to deal with for the rest of your lives, and as Professor Pecorella says, into the lives into the lives of your children. One of the fears I have, and I've spent a little bit more time in this issue, is if we did this bailout now to get us through a hard time in the short run by saying we're going to spend this $170 million over a year to bail out this $5 billion in debt, we have no seed corn to do it if we have another fiscal crisis, you know, how many times can we go to the well? Or is this, you know, I mean, is this the same, does this problem recur?
This is what the assembly members have said. It strikes me as exactly right about what the governor's done. And he's presented them and us with an untenable situation, and again, a very cynical situation. And they had no choice but to do something responsible. I think the true cynicism here is a governor who can now walk around saying, I didn't raise taxes. They did. And have a government that functions because they did indeed raise taxes. I would mention, however, that it was the Assembly Democrats that let go of the commuter tax in the first place. When that occurred a number of years ago, a number of us thought this was not a good idea. The city was in good shape.
And they did it for a short-term political purpose.
That's what people say, and it was a mistake then, and I'm not sure it would have been easy at all to get it back, and I don't know what Mike Bloomberg could do about getting it back.
Well, let's talk about the mayor and the relationship between the mayor and, you know, the mayor and the governor. A couple of people have made reference to it. On the one hand, the mayor seems to feel that by not confronting the governor, by not putting the governor on the spot, that you will not antagonize the governor and he will do less. He won't go out of his way to punish the city. On the other hand, failing to confront the governor puts no pressure on the governor to feel an obligation to come across. So, I mean, no, but I mean, aren't these both legitimate?
Well, but how could the governor do less than he's done? Explain that to me. I mean, unless he wanted to get on a plane and fly somewhere and live, I mean, he could not do less for the residents of the city of New York or the residents of the state of New York. And the truth is that, you know, political parties exist for a reason, because they have relationships. You can make phone calls. There are things that you can do. And so when you have a mayor who's in the same party as the governor, you expect them to be able to talk to each other and try to find resolutions that make things better. As a new member of the Assembly, I just started in January. I mean, it was fascinating to see how hard the city council members and Gifford Miller as the speaker was trying to come up and make and move us to help the city, and the way that the governor and the mayor were absent. And so the question is, you know, what can the governor do less than he's already done? Last year when he was running for re-election, he was giving out money like he was the good humor man. He was going everywhere with checks, knowing full well that there wasn't really money to pay for those programs, but he did it to get himself re-elected. And so the question is, when you have somebody who shows that callous disregard, you know, who do you turn to? Well, in this particular case, we have to turn to the mayor to say, you know what, tell the truth, Mr. Mayor. Tell the truth about what the governor has done. Tell the truth about the way he's treated your residents. Because if you're not willing to tell the truth, then maybe it's time we get a new mayor.
You know, it's interesting that the mayor partly isn't willing to tell the truth about what's going on because he's so down in the polls. I mean, part of the problem that you've got here is the governor, I think you're exactly right, Professor. The governor ran around saying, I'm not going to raise taxes. I'm not going to spend the city and the state into oblivion. The legislature's all wrong, knowing full well that the legislature was then going to give him the money and he was going to spend all the money. So he got, politically, the core vote that he has, his base vote, thinks he was the guy that was fighting borrowing, fighting taxing, fighting government waste and overspending, and trying to rein in the legislature. But then he also got all the money to spend. He's not holding back any of that money. He's not impounding it in any way and saying we shouldn't be spending it, we don't really have it. But he made the mayor be put in a position where the mayor's poll numbers went down. The mayor's taxing, the mayor's borrowing, the mayor's spending money, the mayor's not getting good relationships with labor unions. You've got the governor, he went down in the polls, he lost a lot of his triangulated Democratic vote, and he's back down to his base numbers in New York City. But the mayor fell to the lowest levels we've ever seen an elected official in this region. And he's spending a tremendous amount of political capital trying to get out of the basement. And I think the governor was smart, because now the dynamic between the two of them is he's got the mayor still being the supplicant. If he wants that base vote back from the Republican Party and the conservatives and the homeowners and the Giuliani white ethnics in the boroughs, he needs the governor to get it back for him.
But so much of being a governor or being a mayor is the luck of the draw, in terms of the hand you're dealt. The first President Bush and Mayor Dinkins were dealt the 1987 stock market crash and the subsequent real estate crash and a terrible economy. President Clinton and Governor Giuliani were dealt a very good hand. They had an economy that was rising, which freed them from having to, President Clinton used it to pay down a significant amount of the debt.
Well,
The
he
mayor
might have
did
been
not.
dealt a bad hand, but he wasted a year dealing with the problem. And
Mayor Bloomberg.
Mayor Bloomberg, and the city would have been far better shape today had they started a year earlier.
Well, the question is, would there have been a political cost to the city for confronting the governor?
There
right off the
has
bat?
been, Bob. I mean,
You're saying that there's been a cost for failing to confront
for
the
failing to, yes. I mean, like Danny said, I mean, I don't see what more harm this governor could do to the city of New York. But going back to what Joe was talking about in terms of the mayor's numbers plummeting, he has no one to blame but himself. If nothing else, what the people.
Well, I
of the
think
city,
your argument is that he has the governor to blame, but he won't do it.
Yes,
Right.
and so because he won't do it, he has no one to blame but himself. People elected, in terms of the Republican base, let's be frank about this. The mayor of the city of New York got elected with a great deal of Democratic votes as well. The Democrats, for what, 5, you know better the numbers better than I do, 5-3.
5 to 1. 5 to
Is
1.
it 5 to 1 or 5 to 3?
17% are Republican.
Okay,
Right.
so 5 to 1 more in terms of registered voters here in the city of New York. And they elected this man because they felt that he was able to, from the very bottom, start this giant empire. He must be a tough negotiator. He must be somebody who would get the job done. And here we have him against George Pataki, who folded more times than not with Giuliani. And now he's looking like this big, strong, this strong guy and Mayor Bloomberg is looking weak. So because of that, Bloomberg, I mean, how could you stand by this? How could you how could you let your friends allow you to have to increase taxes, to tell everybody in the city of New York and give them nothing but bad news? And then we turn and read the papers, and all you're doing is fundraisers in your nice townhouse for this Republican Party, who continues to do nothing but take shots at us.
Well, of course, part of the reason that the mayor was elected was that a lot of people in the Bronx sat on their hands on election day for a whole bunch of political reasons.
Well,
having to do,
Mark Green deserved that.
Right, but I'm saying
I'll say that on television. Mark Green deserved that.
But
he was irresponsible in how he handled the whole mayoral campaign, and a lot of people. The Democratic Party is still ailing because of that. If you want to start talking about politics, let's go. I don't have
I think
any
it's a different show,
Let's start
Ruben,
doing
but
it.
the point I'm making.
I'll tell you how I really feel.
The point I'm making is that things happen in politics and therefore in government for reasons that are very complicated. And arguably, even with Mayor Bloomberg, $75 million in spending, absent this bitter split within the Democratic Party, you probably wouldn't have a Mayor Bloomberg. And arguably, relations between Mayor Green and Governor Pataki would probably be a lot worse. We're going to break in a couple of minutes to take a couple of questions if people want to ask questions. But I mean, again, you've been around this business a long time and seen these relationships between mayors and governors, which is a strange political dance, especially when they're in the same party and they have this conflict of interest. How much is politics and how much is government driving this train of this relationship?
Well, I think that the fighting between governors and mayors is basically
Institutional.
It's an institutional fight. The governor has very different interests than the mayor has. But when a governor campaigns aggressively to get New York City votes, to increase his votes in New York City, to get more Hispanic votes, he should be then, after the election, dealing with people a little more fairly. He after 9/11 proposed federal disaster money to go to Syracuse instead of all the money going to New York City. We finally got the president to pledge $21 million.
$21 billion.
$21 billion, excuse me. That money isn't
a billion.
Yeah, it's real money after a while. That money isn't physically here yet. We needed to create the jobs and the economic development the year after the crisis. New York City in jobs and economic development is lagging way behind the rest of the country. And part of the problem is they never actually delivered the money. I mean, sometime in the future, money will be available for things they're building later. But we really didn't get enough money right away to get the city out of its problem.
And that's what the mayor ran on. The mayor ran on, I'm a Republican, the president's a Republican, the governor's a Republican. I'm going to have better relations. I'm going to make this work better than the Democrat would. And so Democrats, for a variety of reasons, abdicated and went with this Republican mayor. And then we turn around and what do we see? I mean, whatever the governor's trying to do, he's not anti-tax. He doesn't call taxes taxes. He calls them fees. Okay, you look at his budget has more fees than anything. There are fees for everything. Fees for sitting down, fees for standing up. He's a fee for everything, but he doesn't call it a tax. And so the reality is it's really a question of what do you call it? If you raise the personal income tax on people who make the most money, we have enough guts to say we're going to raise income taxes. The governor says we're just going to raise the fees. And so the question is, when we have a crisis, which we do, what is the relationship between the mayor and the governor? What is the relationship between the governor and the president to make sure that the promises they make are kept and that the money goes to where it really needs to be, which in this particular case happens to be the city of New York?
Let me go to questions. Tell us your name and where you're from.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Ted. I go to Hunter College. I also serve on the undergraduate student government there. My question is this. It is my understanding that the tuition hike okayed by the Board of Trustees went into effect this semester. This hike, coupled with the recent budget cuts, will have a disastrous effect on enrollment, in spite of claims by the administration that enrollment is up. The fact is many students, some I know personally, have been forced to drop out of school, specifically working parents, working poor, people of color, and so on. What is being done, what can be done to study the effects of this outrage and this attack on CUNY students?
Well, you know, it's interesting. That was the one thing that I found most perplexing about the governor's budget. The one path that I'm aware of to get someone to make more money, to pay more taxes and income taxes, is in education. So if you have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, you generally get paid more money than if you don't. So here you are, you have all these people in these SUNY and CUNY schools, and you're going to raise the tuition so it's prohibitively expensive and cause people to drop out of these schools, which means we will have lower tax revenues from their income in 2, 3, and 4 years. Now, how stupid can that be? I mean, it could not be any dumber, and yet that's exactly what he proposed. The truth is that the CUNY and SUNY systems were designed for those exact populations, and the amount of money that they pay by raising their tuition $1,200 is creating this huge disincentive for people to be able to stay full-time or continuing in their education. And we, as a society, should, for the best reasons, say we should let everyone get an education. But even for the purest, simple reasons of pure government, let's find a way that our citizenry here in New York State make the most money. And the best path for that, get a college degree. Because you're going to make more money the day you get out of college, and guess what? You're going to pay more money in New York City and New York State taxes, which will pay for the services and the bonds that we just refinanced.
I just want to say this. First of all, the governor went to college for free. And moreover, in our budget this year, what we wind up doing is that we raised the ceiling on the amount of income for eligibility for tuition assistance, knowing that we were going to have an increase. And finally, I just want to say that there is an increase in enrollment in CUNY, and I was happy to see that. And while we realize and understand that there are many people still in our city and throughout the state of New York who find it very difficult to pay for tuition, there's still more work that needs to be done. We need the governor to cooperate.
I will point out, this is a little historical note. I graduated Brooklyn College in 1970, and when I began, it was totally free. We paid $30 a semester in student fees. And then at one point in my 4 years, this is the late 1960s, they raised it from $30 to $50, and we shut the place down. But that was it. I'm not recommending that. I'm on a CUNY show.
No, I would recommend that from the students.
Well, I will
think that
not
the students
recommend
need to
that.
mobilize, and that's what needs to happen. I think that this governor, as well as the mayor and anybody else who decides to run statewide or citywide, needs to realize that there's a monster in the student body throughout the city and the state of New York. And like I said earlier, many of the different movements that we've seen in this country and throughout this world have been started by the mobilization of college students, and I think that that's what needs to happen. I think if we start holding these elected officials accountable, I mean, if you're a student at CUNY or SUNY, ask yourself the question: if there's so many hundreds of thousands of students, why are these decisions being made? These decisions would not be made for other segments of the population throughout the state of New York. I think that the answer to that is that this governor just doesn't feel like there's going to be any political reprisal by attacking the student body. I think we need to prove him wrong.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Yeda Nev from Mega Evers College, student of public administration. Having listened to the discussion about suggests that the governor is having problem in agreement in terms of financial distribution to the state of New York, which vis-a-vis hard financial burden on the citizens. My question is there any legal means, procedure-wise, to twist the governor's arm to comply with what you want?
Well, in the case of the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, in terms
that's what I was about to say. We just want
in
a huge
terms of
victory.
school funding inequities, there was a lawsuit that the state fought against and was approved by that was approved by Judge DeGrassi and eventually upheld by the Court of Appeals, which is the state's highest court. But I think the argument you guys were making is that you see foot dragging on the part of the governor in trying to carry out the mandates of the court.
Yeah.
And how could he possibly not? I mean, he goes into court and says an eighth grade education is sufficient for our children. Then when the Court of Appeals says, I'm really sorry, but your reading of the law is really wrong, then he turns around and says, all right, I'm going to ignore the city of New York when figuring out who to appoint a commission to fix this problem.
Yeah, but the other point, let me ask Professor Pecorella, the argument that he's not complying with the mandates of the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit, and the fact that he's not complying with the mandates of the budget that the legislature passed over his veto. I mean, is there? It seems to me there's a legal issue here.
Well, I think the interesting part of the question is if you look around the country in almost every state where education has in fact been equalized or attempts have been made to equalize spending in education, it comes out of court systems. Legislatures and governors have been very, very hesitant to attack essentially a middle-class tax base in the suburbs and tell them, look, you've got to spend some money on inner-city education, or in this state, rural education, which also suffers in terms of per capita expenditure per student at primary and secondary levels. What I think the governor's going to do, and I don't think this is a big surprise, is he's going to postpone this thing past your session as much as he can coming up in 2004 and buy another year of the kind of foot dragging with enough done to meet the law, but not enough done to make any difference. We're going to wind up back in court.
You know, before 9/11, I asked one of my cousins who was talking about how the city became so much nicer in the last decade. Nicer place to live, crime rates plummeting, parks are cleaner, streets are cleaner, more jobs, and so on. I said, well, if you think the city's getting better, you're going to move back. And he said, are you crazy? My kids have a planetarium in their high school. I'm not going to move back until my kids are out of college. New York City, because of the way the state treats the city, doesn't even deal with the health and safety needs of the students in the physical plant of the school system. This system should be a gold-plated Cadillac version of an education system. It's the greatest city in the world. We hunger for highly trained workers, yet the governor neglects the system so that he could lavish suburban school systems. It's really very unfair.
Yes, sir.
My name is Jeffrey Sanders. I'm with the College of Staten Island, and what no one seems to realize is, how about Staten Island? Now, we have a governor who has put his own people in the transit system, his own people in the CUNY system, and basically, I'm sorry to say, CUNY screwed us with this tuition hike. CUNY screwed up, the MTA screwed us with the fare hike, and it's like, when we needed people to represent us to say, listen, we are against it, nobody was there. It was just a bunch of those students, maybe a few of the assemblymen who were there. But you know what? I feel if we had more people who were with us outside City Hall back in February, where were you?
Well, the question is, I don't know what the voting turnout is among CUNY students, but there is a degree to which, apathy is a killer, and so, there's some degree to which people have to see their own interests and act on them, and that doesn't always happen to the proper degree. I also think, since I seem to be the closest thing to a defender of the governor here, that somebody has to do it. That I think that some historical context is that our transit fare, for instance, at $2 is significantly less than the transit fare in most other cities.
Oh, but come on.
And wait a minute. There is room for some historical context here. And even the CUNY tuition you know, is relatively low compared to public university systems elsewhere in the country. You know, I'm a product of Brooklyn College, and I don't know that I could have, and I grew up in the projects of Brooklyn, I don't know that I could have afforded whatever the comparable tuition would have been in those days. So you know, I am...
You can't defend the indefensible.
I am not defending it. I'm just trying to put some context
into it. Who wants to
into it.
increase the fares, and yet they have two books, one showing that they have, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars that they didn't want to tell anybody about. It's a quasi, you know, private, quasi-government, you know, agency, and everybody in there is appointed by the governor. And, you know, he's the one who should be held responsible for this. Once again, that's another issue where we can, you know, prove that the governor turns his back on the people of the city of New York.
And when historically, the transit authority really didn't pay for itself out of the fare. I mean, the way we built the subway...
commuter railroads pay a far
well,
smaller
yeah, but
percentage of their operating costs with the fares than the city. You know, city transit riders pay a much higher percentage.
The way
of
you
fare.
build commuter rails and subway systems in cities is you build them, and then it increases the tax value of the community, and the tax revenue, the general funds get so much bigger. I mean, historically in New York City, the way the city expanded was building the subway system, and then having the real estate in those communities that the rail lines went into vastly improved the city's revenue base. And we're not doing that anymore. We separated the city treasury from the fare system, and now the fare has to keep the system going.
And I don't like to contradict
really
the moderator
totally
because it's really kind of
ridiculous.
rude.
The
the moderator.
The moderator just feels an obligation to provide some level of balance.
But the facts are mistaken, because what the real question is, we as New York City subway riders pay the highest percentage of our fare in terms of what subsidies. When you go to Boston, you know what they're getting a lot of the government money to subsidize what it is. And so we in New York City pay the most of anywhere in the country. The highest percentage of the fare is in fact coming out of the ridership itself. And that's really what the problem is. We as a country need to reduce our energy dependence. We need to increase mass transportation. We need to make it better and more valuable and more accessible to everybody, not the other way around. And the way to do that is to make it as affordable as possible and get more people riding on it and get the government to participate in that decision-making process.
I will say, by the way, that he can't yell at me too much because I am his constituent.
I need his vote.
You know, the other side of it is, it's not just a fare increase. It's not just a tuition increase. This governor and this mayor, Bloomberg and Pataki, raised every nuisance fee, every ticket, every fee they could get their hands on. And what you have when you do that, as opposed to raising income taxes on wealthy people, is you're taking working class people and people just getting into the middle class, and you're making their lives more difficult. They've trashed the quality of life of working class people and middle class people in New York City by you have to take it all together.
I agree.
There's a tremendous load of revenue that little guys are paying now at a time when the federal government reduced income taxes on wealthy people tremendously. And the city didn't take that opportunity, and the state didn't take the opportunity to raise a little bit more tax on wealthy people. Instead, the governor and the mayor went after these nuisance taxes, which affect working class people.
It's not a very
You raise
progressive
an
system.
interesting point, Joe. I mean, if you take a father in a family of 5 in my district in Harding Park who smokes cigarettes, he not only does he have to pay 18.5% more on property taxes, he has to pay more in terms of tuition to send his children to CUNY or SUNY. He has to pay more to get to work in terms of the fares in the subways or the train station. He has to pay the cigarette tax, sales tax, and this is really breaking the backs of the engine that makes the city
And
thrive.
salaries, salaries are not keeping, and union contracts are not keeping.
And I just have to mention this, that for the
track.
first time, I think ever, Daniel, we were able to implement a progressive tax, income tax, in the state of New York, where those people who are making the most money pay, a higher percentage in tax.
And the technology mayor, I mean, this is a mayor who came out of a technology industry. We thought he was going to do a lot of stuff in government to reform technology. So what did he do at the police department? He didn't get them new digital radios, so they failed a lot during the blackout. Instead, he's giving them better computers, handheld computers, so that we could collect ticket taxes better, right?
Well said.
So he didn't give the cops better radios to help in emergencies. He gave them better ticket writing computers.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Lanika Leon, and I'm from John Jay College, and I have a couple of questions. One, why do you think that the mayor has allowed the governor to be so cynical towards New York? And how could our city councilmen, the people who are our voices, allow this as well? And what is our other alternative than to mobilize, because we were out there when they were raising the tuition hike and we weren't being heard? So what do you recommend that we do to
Elect
be
a
heard?
Democratic mayor and a Democratic governor.
And a Democratic
doesn't-
president, and then we're rolling.
I feel like
Failing that, one thing we may want to look at is, I don't know what Mayor Bloomberg really can do. And it puts him in an untenable situation. To ask him to attack a Republican governor and then run on the notion that he has relationships with a Republican governor, why not have a Democrat who can really attack a Republican governor elected? The governor, again, and I keep using the word cynical, and if you look at the way he's won election over the years, in 94 and 98, the least percentage of the vote in New York City for any governor in the history of New York State. In 2002, almost, I think, 40% of the vote in New York City. This is an incredible turnaround, a very capable politician. And then he turns around and does to New York City what he did to upstate, walk away from the disaster, leaving this with the mayor. Now, but I just don't know what the mayor's supposed to do. Saying rude things to the governor doesn't strike me as being something that's going to be productive for him either.
Well, that's also one of the reasons that the revolution in the Republican State Senate getting together with the Democratic Assembly to pass a budget over the governor's veto is unprecedented and should send a sign that perhaps, that the governor should have gotten some message that he's out of touch with his own party. And,
Right,
and the Republican State Senate is not a Rockefeller Republican State Senate.
No, but the reality is that part of what happened is that the city council members from New York City, you ask where they were, they came to Albany. They came to Albany, and they didn't even make an appointment with me. They didn't need to talk to me. But they made appointments with Republican state senators. They made appointments with upstate Democrats who may not fully understand certain issues, and they moved that process along. They made it easier for us to override those vetoes by what they were able to bring. That is what the mayor should have been doing. The mayor should have lived in Albany. He should have been living there every day just like we were, to make sure that the issues were explained clearly so that everyone understood just how desperate the situation was. And that's where I criticize him for his failure to be there.
Right. The Assemblyman is exactly right. I mean, it's not a question of the mayor being brash and hostile. He should be forming coalitions of people in the city to go up and make it clear to the governor and the Republicans in the legislature that we need stuff.
What mayor has
He
done
never
that?
did that. He gave them a pass and let them get away with stuff. That's the difference.
What mayor
He didn't
has,
fight
what mayor
for the
has done
city.
that effectively?
If I'm saying, she also had one last question as to what to do in lieu of, protesting or mobilization. I think you have to let your voices be heard through the ballot box. You, Joe, of all people, you look at the numbers, and we have databases that show us what age group comes out. It could clearly show us if a certain age group or a certain segment of the population votes or doesn't vote. And I think that what we need to do in the future, when you have a governor or a mayor who is, going out with his consultants and they're trying to see if a certain age group or people in the universities are out and vote, I think that we need to change the numbers that we see there today, because the numbers that we see today are very low numbers. And so therefore, once again, they're making decisions without thinking that there's going to be any political reprisal here.
If young people come out and vote and form coalitions like they did in the 70s, you could change government.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Mark Candela. I'm from College of Staten Island. I just want to thank you for your time tonight. In this day and age of financial awareness and fiscal responsibility, what is the political system doing in justifying increasing the length of debt when the average layman knows to make principal payments on their house or pay off their car a little bit quicker? It'll make the loan cheaper in the end. So what's being used to justify this
Again, you raise a very interesting point, and it's a tough decision. But if we don't pick up the MAG debt, then the only alternative that we had was passing a budget where we were gonna stop people from getting a higher education, and stop our students in the city of New York and from K through 8 from having the best quality education possible. I think in the long run, you were going to see a lot of these folks not get decent jobs, not become productive members of society, not raising revenue for the state of New York, and probably the complete opposite. Maybe some of them may turn to the life of crime or something, and we're going to wind up paying even more money incarcerating these individuals. So I think when you look at what we have in terms of the cards that we are dealt, it's a very tough decision. But I'd rather choose picking up the MAG debt and having to pay the $170 million a year in the long run.
And I also think that the responsible thing, and which was addressed earlier, was what happens in the good times. These are bad times. We have to make bad decisions. What are the decisions that are made in the good time? What did Mayor Giuliani do when there was a lot of money in the city? Did he pay off this debt? What did the allegedly conservative governor do when money was flowing freely? The answer was he did not pay off. So the answer is that when things are better, we need to be as responsible as we can, but when in desperate times, we need to make sure that we are providing the basic services that Ruben refers to, and that was the decision that we made, and I stand by it.
If we pick up this MAC debt, I think that we help this New York City revitalize and have the economy revitalized. And remember that New York City gives over $5 billion to the state than it receives back from the budget. If we're able to thrive the economy here in the city of New York, we could go back to those days. And if we give a higher payment than $170 million, it wouldn't have to take 30 years. We could shrink the years down, and we can move on from there.
Good. I think we can get another question in.
Good evening. My name is Akram Lewis from John Jay College. Okay, my question is, New York City mainly runs on a global economy. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we are much better off than we were in 1975 during the recession, when gas prices went up and Americans either parked their cars or bought smaller cars. But my question is, what can the governor and the mayor do to try to boost up the economy in order to get New York back on its feet? Because I don't think they can do anything.
One little piece of history is one of the reasons that we are not in as bad shape as we were in 1975 is because of changes that were made in the aftermath of 1975, specifically, at least as far as the city is concerned. We have to do what's called a 4-year budget, a 4-year fiscal plan. So we have to be honest about the problems that we see coming at us, whereas the state and every other government jurisdiction I'm aware of around, I mean, you know this better than I do, they do 1-year budget and it's very short term and you can kind of shunt everything off into the out years without having to admit it. It's much harder not to be, the city system, which I think is a very good system, forces you to be more honest about what your problems are.
Yeah, New York City's budget since 1975 is balanced according to generally accepted accounting principles, right?
We are stopped because we have so many people, we meaning the city, overseeing us, the Financial Control Board, the Municipal Assistance Corporation, the New York State Comptroller's City Comptroller Office. We have all these people looking at us, and the citizen, the private groups like the Citizen Budget Commission. We're the most analyzed budget process in the world. And that also serves our purposes in keeping us from falling into the hole. Plus, if we fall $100 million into the hole at the end of any fiscal year, the state can come in and take over the city and take over the city.
But I think the important thing is to learn the lessons from 1975, and some of those lessons, I was very young then, Bob. But one of the lessons was you have to provide basic services.
Respect your elders.
I will, and my constituents, yes. You have to learn the lessons, and the lessons are if you don't provide for safety and services, if you don't provide fire protection, and if you don't provide viable schools, then people will leave the city and no longer be part of its tax base. And so we need to be very careful that we provide services so that if somebody's here, that they're not going to leave. Because when they're here, like us, we pay our city taxes. And so we need to keep our eye on the ball, make decisions that Ruben says, that make sure that the future is there for those children, that they have a place to get a good education, and that we provide those basic services. And if we walk away from them and don't do those things, we run the risk of solving the problem today financially at the risk of bankrupting the city 2 years from now.
I also want to add this, that it takes anywhere from $33,000 to $37,000 a year to house an inmate in the state of New York. I think it's about time that we repeal Rockefeller drug law. It would free up a lot of the money. And another thing that a lot of folks are not talking about that's extremely innovative in terms of raising revenue for the state of New York is to really look at how we develop a system where we collect sales tax from exchanges that are done in the internet. we're losing billions of dollars, maybe anywhere from 1.7 to $2.5 billion a year for the state of New York by not having this mechanism. And this is not going to happen overnight. It's more complex than what I know is easier said than done. But I think that we collectively, not only in the state of New York, but in this nation, we really have to look at how is it that we collect those taxes from the sales that are done on the internet, and it would help increase the revenue for the state of New York.
First, let me, you know, we're dealing with with these eternal tensions between the city and the state, and there's personalities involved, and there's politics involved, and there's institutional prerogatives involved, and you should never discount each side protecting its own institutional prerogative. I covered city hall budgets for years, and you know, while there's all this personality and politics, the legislative and the executive institutional struggle is very real. Nobody wants to be the one to give up power. Is there any creative thinking out there in the universe that tries to kind of buck these trends? Is there a middle ground, or are these? It's always been thus, and it will always be so.
James Madison's great statement that ambition must be made to counteract ambition from the Federalist Papers. The ambition of the state legislature and the ambition of the governor will be constantly at odds.
As the ambition of the mayor and the ambition of the governor.
That's the way the system is structured. It's structured so one would not buy stock in it if it were a private company, but as a government, I don't think it works that bad. And I think that in bad times it becomes easy to criticize it, but generally speaking, it's not been a terribly unsuccessful political setup here in New York or in the country.
It's a little unbalanced, though, because we've created so many off-budget authorities that give the governor a disproportionate relationship with the legislature and the mayor.
And no responsibility. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. If, in fact, the people of the city and the state of New York blame the governor for a variety of these things that these agencies do that he appoints everyone to, then it would be somewhat different. But he gets to say, well, you know what, it's not me, I'm not responsible, like the MTA, and that creates a difficulty as well.
Remember that these authorities were the brainchild of Robert Moses so that he can have absolute power. And so this happened so many years ago. I think it's time we start revisiting.
Well, you know, it's I think we can end at this point, is that government reform works in cycles, and that the creation of all these agencies was to somewhat depoliticize the governmental process and to try to get these services, you know, the transit authority, now the MTA, the port authority, the school construction authority, the dormitory authority. All those were great progressive reforms. And Eddie Kostikian, who was a deputy mayor under Mayor Koch, and is one of the grand old men, always said that every now and then you have to reform the reforms. And maybe we're in one of those points. But I've just gotten the sign that says goodbye, and I always obey the goodbye sign. I want to thank everybody, and we will see you next time. Thank you.